Thank you very much for joining us. And I am very, very happy and proud to be able to share this presentation with you all this morning. My name is DRC Neal, and I am one of 5 of ECNV's Agents of Change. And we are presenting our 2022 end of year report. And I will be kind of the host and moderator going along through this presentation today for you all to see kind of what we've been working on and what we have in store for the next year. So starting off, essentially, we have had an opportunity to gather a lot of information and talk to a lot of people. And one of the things that struck us the most interestingly in the middle of one of our recordings was this commentary from 9-time Paralympian Candace Cable when she was talking about disability as like kind of a holistic experience. And she pointed out that it's a lousy game. Our lives as disabled folk are labor intensive already because we're trying to create access in a world that does not create access for us readily. She said that a lot of times people think that inclusion means access, and it doesn't. And so, you know, this quote really helped kind of sum up some of the key issues that we were kind of looking at over the last fiscal year. And, you know, we thought it was a really inclusive way to kind of put everything together. And so, you know, I want to start this presentation off in the spirit of access and inclusion because that's really the core of what we're trying to get at. And so in the presentation today, as far as an agenda, there was a couple of things that I want to go over. First, there'll be an introduction where we kind of talk about what the Agents of Change even are and who we are, as well as our primary goals and our timeline. And then we'll kind of talk about the 3 issues that we kind of came to work on over the period of the last year and how each of those kind of operates. Basically, the way that this presentation will be split up is that we'll give an overview of the issues. We'll give kind of an example of a conversation that we had about that issue and some information that came up. And then we have a number of suggestions and interventions that we've created, as well as the ending for our summary and references. We have several pages of references, which will be of great use to anyone that's seeing this presentation. And so first and foremost, the Agents of Change. You know, it is a initiative that was funded by the Ford Foundation and the Independent Center of Northern Virginia in order to answer one question. What is the future of interdependent disability in America? And so as part of that group, like I said, you have myself. I am an academic and disability theorist, and I specialize in race and digital media. We have Teresa Champion, who is a legal advocate in Virginia for disability and social issues. She's also a member of the bar in Kentucky and Washington State. We have Emma Budway, who is an autistic self-advocate working in the areas of educational and housing policy. We have Marcos Castillo, who is a social media and political activist working in immigration and housing reform. And then we also have Joshua Wilson, who is an IT and communication specialist working in employment and vocational rehabilitation policy issues. And so, you know, this project tried to incorporate as many different kinds of disability as we can. We also tried to make sure that we were equitable about like gender and or sexual orientation issues. So it comes from as wide a background as we could get. We've got, you know, as many different types of racial equity as we could, and we wanted to make sure that we try to encapsulate as many different issues as possible. But, you know, the question about interdependence is complicated and complex. And so we wanted to make sure that, you know, unlike a lot of other initiatives, that we were not all just cis able-bodied white people sitting on a panel kind of talking about, you know, how to make change in the world, because that's not really equitable, and nor is it appropriate. And so, the first step for the initiative was making sure that we had uh, a different mix of people, and I think we did really well with that. And so, in terms of our timeline, so over the course of one fiscal year, we were given time to consider the challenges and the ideas in the disability community, and we were able to pick the ones that we strongly wanted to change. So if you look at this timeline, you'll see that our group was established in October of last year. And then we kind of spent about 3 months or so just kind of talking about different things that we wanted to kind of work on and what was the most important things to us. And so we kind of got our key areas established in January, and we started working on some side projects. And then in May, we began an intensive workshop on stakeholders and key players in different areas of community. And then using that information, we were able to, by August, create podcast episodes. We had a number of articles that were released, and we did 4 different recordings to be released to either the public or to private channels, kind of going over various parts of what we were thinking about. And you'll see all of that in this presentation. And then, of course, the final report was put together in September. And we are reorganizing to start for phase 2, which should be starting about now in October. And so to understand the way that this project was conceived, the very first thing that we started talking about was the role of ableism, right? And, it's important to point that out at the start, that, no project is even conceived without thinking about how ableism works. You can't talk about disability without thinking about how ableism is affected. And so, I just thought it was important to point out that, ableism, or the evaluation of the non-disabled body, is the primary disruptor to disability rights. Picking on any one thing is important, but, without understanding the ways that ableism impacts that, it's not going to be impactful. And so, whether you're blocking access to the quality of life, or employment, or finances, or family planning, it all serves as the chief obstacle in today's struggle for disability rights. And that's, like, for example, a huge difference between now and 1960, when disability rights was kind of started off and theorized. Back then, people were just trying to say, I'm a disabled person, and I want the ability to work. Well, we have that now. And so, kind of one of the biggest questions that we were asking was, we've had the ability to work and to get married and to, experience all the things in life that we deserve. So why isn't it happening? And the answer is ableism. And so as our group, our first priority was recognizing the goal of the task of interdependence, and to try and to understand it more fully, so we could understand, like, the best ways to kind of tackle it. And to that, we came up with this lovely diagram, which is basically, as you can see, a giant tree, which we kind of call the roots of disability. And the trunk of the tree is ableism. And, it kind of talks about, the one thing in life that is the biggest problem. And from there, from the root, from the trunk, just like a tree, you have all of these roots that spread out in all these different directions. And essentially, they're clustered around things like community and marriage equality and criminal justice and financial knowledge and poverty, for example. And so we took this diagram that we spent several weeks kind of just mapping out, literally, to get into the specifics of, if, for example, someone with a disability is living in poverty, why are they living in poverty? Like, what is it about the system that keeps someone with a disability in poverty? And so we tried to just break it into the smallest pieces we could. And then we looked at this diagram, the clusters of things into a number of different groups. And, like I said, by starting with the main idea of the quality of life in the trunk, or the idea that governs how a person is meant to exist, as I said, we broke down various concepts that govern how disabled people are meant to live every day. Many of the clusters represent groups like education, ableism, housing, social issues, and financial literacy, which we splintered into smaller pieces to get at nuanced reasons as to why disability organizations persist in a post-ADA society. Those sections were then categorized through influencers and shareholders in an attempt to think about who we could speak to in an efficient way to make change. So basically, once we grouped everything into pieces, we then broke it down into, who are the influencers that we could talk to that would have the greatest effect to make a change on this. And so we broke that into primary goals. And as a result, we decided that interdependence essentially revolves around three core principles. And this is what we started working on in January. And we include them under housing, employment, and social empowerment. And each of those are presented in the presentation today. So first off, housing, arguably the most important because having a roof over your head is a basic human need. And so that was kind of where we started. And so we had a number of things that came up, with housing, everything is complicated, but we basically boiled down what we thought were the five biggest issues. The first one being supply, that the amount of available accessible housing is far behind the demand. Number two, research, the ability to look for and schedule things like walkthroughs for accessible housing is extremely hard to find. So just finding the actual housing itself is difficult. Third, leasing. The language of most leases is complicated and it's hostile toward accommodations and universal design. Number four, live-in options. Most housing doesn't offer options for disabled people and their caregivers to coexist. And so that it's like, even if you do find the housing and you're lucky enough to get everything you want approved in the leasing, if you happen to have a caregiver with you, most apartment complexes don't offer options around that. And then fifth, inaccessible design of the actual unit. Most housing is built without universal design in mind, making accommodations both expensive and temporary, which is really, really important when you're trying to create new housing options in 2022. And so those are the five biggest things that we identified as the major issues. And so one of the first things we did was have a discussion with realtors and housing agents around this issue to try and identify, like, what are the major roadblocks? Like, why is this keep happening? Especially if your job as a realtor is to help people find housing, then, people with disabilities should be a primary customer. Like, why is this not working? And so we had a realtor-based discussion group where we had various locales across the US represented. And some of the specific issues that were raised in that meeting was the lack of realtor training on disability housing, aside from the Fair Housing Act. So apparently they really only have one class dedicated to accessibility, and it falls solely under the Fair Housing Act. They don't talk about it again. The second one was a lack of knowledge on disability supply and contractor information. So it was like, even if there were things available to help people with disabilities, they don't have the information to know where to find it or who to talk to. And then the third one was in relation to that, there's no partnership between centers of independent living, known as CILs, or state agencies as referral services. And so, basically it's kind of like, there are programs designed to help people with disabilities find housing, but they're typically through state agencies and the realtors don't speak to them. Like, there's no co-communication. The left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. And it just creates this giant mess. And so one of the key quotes that we got from the meeting and the conversation came from Kenyatta Green, who is a senior vice president for affordable housing at Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority. And she said, thinking through universal design, I never thought about wall plugins or where they are, or even how many were available. I hadn't thought about the Ring doorbells or a Wi-Fi booster. And she was like, these are all things that we can pass on to developers to make sure that they're included. And so in our conversation that we had with public housing, she basically was like, my eyes are open. And she was like, this has been such an interesting conversation. And she's the person directly responsible over approving what gets made and built in the city of Richmond. And so just to be able to have the conversation with someone like her, where she was like, I get it. And she was like, this is really important. And the understanding that, like, for example, if you're non-vocal and you use internet services, having the ability to have Wi-Fi booster, people think about it in terms of entertainment and luxury, whereas, for non-vocal people with disabilities, like that's a necessity. So being able to have something that increases the wattage of your machinery, so you can use it more effectively, would be really important. And it just never even occurred to her. So, she, as well as other people who were present in that meeting, really understood like the impact of what we were talking about, and basically how you can approach this from it's not just a good idea for business, but it's really a good idea just for a humanitarian side. And we really appreciated the conversation that we had that day. And so as a result of that conversation, we were able to come up with a number of suggested housing interventions, the first of which is to host SIL and AOC trainings. So through either local locations or centers of independent living, we could connect local realtors who want to know more about how to serve diverse clients by hosting certified training sessions to increase both the partnerships between local disability agencies, local contractors, and realtors looking to rent and sell housing. Case in point, if you're a realtor and you have a disabled client, if you're working with a SIL and they can give you a list of contractors who already know how to do that work, then those two things together can kind of bleed in. And it would be helpful to be able to do that work so that everybody is kind of working together. Secondly, looking at partnerships in design. If you're a local housing developer, you can work with building agencies and universal design firms to reconsider current and future apartment designs for disability needs by considering ideas of space, technology, and personal care as part of the needs of a future tenant or homeowner. Also, there should be a website to search for available accessible housing that's already on the current market. So obviously there are websites like apartments.com and any number of websites that able-bodied people can use to find housing, but that information does not currently bleed into accessible housing. So we were talking about developing a website to address that need, and by working with realtors to kind of create a need where it exists. And then third, we were talking about lease clause changes. That leasing language could be changed and updated to reflect ideas of certain accommodations made as permanent upgrades to existing housing units in order to increase disability and accessible supply. By partnering with organizations like AARP, that would be beneficial to connections to age in place commodities. So the bottom line is thinking about it not just in terms of disability, but also aging would make the ability to add modifications in apartments and housing as permanent upgrades. So that way you can say, we have a greater supply of disability housing. We have units that have ramps already installed. We have units with more Wi-Fi or more wall plugins. Like, this has already been addressed, and we do have a number of units. So that way you're not trying to rebuild things from scratch. On the second page, we were talking about the idea of having dedicated units for people with disabilities. So we propose that 10% of rentable housing units be designated and created for people with disabilities as a standardized position. So right now, this is kind of up to state agencies and like local municipalities as to whether or not they do this. But we're asking that, like, for example, this just become a standard practice across the board, and that these units would be dedicated so that if needed by people with disabilities, they would be made available if already occupied by non-disabled tenants. Subsequently, the renters who are non-disabled would be required to acknowledge that the unit is subject to reassignment. And so also consideration and allowances should be made for cohabitating caregivers. The bottom line is if you really want to increase supply and demand, then you need to make a number of units available for reassignment if a disabled person were to move in. And the bottom line is the people who live there, because it's easier for non-disabled people to find housing, you literally can just make that an adjustment in your housing policy. And that would help to shore up the supply and demand issue immediately. We were talking about the fact that there should be accessible universal design units and that accessible housing should guarantee safe ingress and egress on lower floors when available. Aside from that, other considerations should include things like wide doors, step-in baths, low countertops, and multiple outlets with increased Wi-Fi bandwidth, along with higher voltage outlets for charging electric wheelchairs, as well as a room and storage options for durable medical equipment. Because as the apartments get smaller and smaller, people with disabilities still have needs that have to be met. So these are all things that should be taken into consideration, as well as for the final one, increased public disclosure and availability. That there should be a more established link between disability and realtor organizations with the ultimate goal to make multiple listing services transparent for accessible dwellings. So, again, if we're talking about apartments.com or, any rentable service, that there literally should be a section for accessible housing. That would be like the future of what we're asking. Further, that through places like centers of independent living, that they include users of these services and or the disability community to assess and monitor the accessibility of any of the advertised units. So the bottom line is, if you are a developer and you want to make your unit accessible, or you want to say we have units available to advertise to the public, go to a center of independent living first. Get in touch with some of their people with disabilities, have them do a walkthrough to basically give you a checklist and say, yes, you were able to do X, Y, and Z. These things are appropriate and they meet our needs. Great, feel free to advertise this, and you can advertise it through us. Basically having the Center of Independent Living be you're one of your biggest supporters. Use the resources that are already in the community. We're not asking for the wheel to be reinvented, but it's really just connecting the dots that are already there and making use of what's already in the community. So in summary, basically we said that finding housing development organizations that are open to disability partnerships are critical in this. By utilizing disability integrated housing models with universal design, that will prove beneficial, and that further consideration should be given to study and replicate these ideas toward a national scale. So for example, one of our AOCs, Emma, lives in a housing development, our stomping ground, which has a wonderful program where they replicate many of these ideas already. And that, because it works so well, for this singular area, we were saying this should be replicated on a national scale, that you should be studying our stomping ground and the way that they do housing and, the way that they kind of make it all work, and that it should be basically a best practice that's kind of replicated in multiple ways. And then, but we also were saying that a database and a website would be both helpful and beneficial for both sides, renters and realtors, by connecting realtors to potential homeowners and disabled tenants to potential business partners. The bottom line is everybody needs a house, everybody needs a roof, and because everybody has to have a place to live, if everybody's going to talk about economics, and since everybody wants to talk about money, then this is beneficial to both sides. The realtors get the commissions that they need, and the people with disabilities get the housing that they need. And so that would be the most helpful. And it also, we think our suggestions would prove to be very helpful and beneficial in providing concrete solutions to issues that are actually a huge problem. Second up is the issue of employment. And so several of the issues that were identified is that, when it comes to employment, one of the biggest issues is looking for work. The first thing is that disability-friendly employment is difficult to locate, and that permanent or placement agencies complicate data entry. Basically, when you're asked to enter the same thing multiple times, it kind of just slows the process down. Second, interviewing issues of disclosure often complicate accessibility before work is even offered. And then here, ableism and bias is a huge factor. Third, transportation. The lack of options make finding transportation and keeping employment difficult without subsidies or remote work available. And of course, in the era of Corona, this is one of the biggest slaps in the face for the disability community. The fact that now remote work is semi-permanent, and the fact that people with disabilities haven't had that option is really annoying. Fourth, work culture. So the lack of a visible disability work culture creates feelings of stigma and tokenism. Basically, if you don't see people with disabilities in a meaningful way in your organization, then you either assume they don't exist, or B, that if the only people with disabilities you do see in your organization are all the interns, or all of the people who are entry level, that doesn't help to create a pathway for leadership, which leads to the fifth section, a lack of opportunity via lack of upward mobility for disabled workforce, which basically means that candidates stay stuck in entry-level positions or are underemployed. And so, these were some of the five biggest issues that we identified in relation to employment. And so when we had a conversation about it, one of the quotes that really stuck out to us was from one of our participants, Joanna Vernon, who literally said, I may not know all the accommodations I need until I get into the job. And this particular quote is very important because the focus is often so much on, ask for the accommodations beforehand. Make sure you get all this information beforehand. HR companies are trained to ask for accommodations ahead of time. And, as a consultant myself for organizations where they've done this, I've made the comment and the statement to them that doing that, you run the risk of exposing personal biases ahead of time, because depending on who is looking at the resume and who is looking at the work, that can affect whether or not the person is hired in the first place. Aside from the fact that, as Joanna pointed out, needs change. After a disabled person is hired and when they start the job, they may come to discover that the accommodations that they told you either aren't the correct ones, or that they need to make updates. The bottom line is people with disabilities often don't tell their employers that information because they don't want to be seen as a burden. And I know that, I myself have definitely been in that position a number of times where you don't want to say anything to rock the boat. You're new and you just want to be grateful for the fact that you're working at all, when in reality, it's the employer's job to ensure that they're doing the best thing that they can for all of their workers. But because this is such a prevalent issue, people don't speak up about it. And then they tend to stay silent, which is what creates all of these issues. And so we had a meeting about this very issue and we had a bunch of discussion about it. And from our discussion, we came up with a number of interventions to this. The first would be to create a tool for people with disabilities seeking employment and training. And by combining access to information with an employment-ready workforce, disabled people can work with the federal government, as well as with governmental data, toward the goal of earning an income while minimizing the procedural barriers in place. The bottom line is the federal government already takes up so much data and information in relation to this topic, then yes, the Social Security Administration already knows who is drawing on Social Security. And they also know typically, if you're looking for work, what kind of data you have to report on a weekly basis. So we basically were like, well, why can't we just put those two things together? If you're a disabled person and you're looking for work, there should be a website that basically should have it spelled out for you. And you should be able to have it directly connected through your Social Security information. The fact that those two things aren't already connected is kind of annoying, but it does bring up the point that, like, typically this information does come into play when you're non-disabled and you're looking for work, but it doesn't come into play when disability is factored in. And so that leads to the second point where we talk about a spend down provision to be expanded in order to relieve the fear of losing social services. So at the state level, uh, we suggest to either increase or expand the personal expense deduction for care costs directly related to disability. And so this would allow the barrier for people with disabilities to achieve and retain sustainable employment. The biggest issue for people with disabilities working is the amount of money that they actually earn, and so by expanding that barrier, it literally allows people to have a greater quality of life. That should be a number one priority. And there have been a number of things in place to start to do that work. But we're suggesting that it should get way more attention and receive way greater amount of publicity so that the general public is aware that this is a major issue for people with disabilities who are trying to work. Especially since the goal is to make money, but if you're being told that you can only have so much, obviously it creates huge gaps. And so, third and final, we also talked about the fact of creating clauses for employment manuals. First, to extend accommodations and protections offered during COVID, especially for people who are working who might be immunocompromised, and for remote work employment. Basically, since so many companies established work protections and remote work options during COVID, keep them. Basically find a way to make those work for your job. So that way everybody is happy. If people want to come into the office, great. If they don't want to come into the office, great. And if they're not capable of coming into the office, that is also fine. In making sure that people are doing what they need to do in order to be able to maintain work and work accommodations. And then secondly, that those accommodations should not be static, but rather flexible and dynamic in order to be personalized and responsive to the needs of the employee. So, as I was saying earlier, if a person comes into a job and then they decide things need to be changed, that they can go to HR in order to make those accommodations flexible and that they can be updated and changed as needed, instead of it being kind of like an entry first time question that's asked when you get there and then never asked again. And the bottom line is we basically said that the concept of working is inherently ableist because it revolves around the idea of production. And so when you have limited transportation options alongside traditional beliefs in job coaching, fear within disability communities and employment creates like a stagnation. Further, current job placement agencies require multiple pages of data entry, which could be streamlined into a singular website that would locate various types of jobs specific to the disability entered. Basically, we said that people with disabilities need a way to find accommodating jobs as well as places to go to gain relevant training and skills. And all of this kind of helps to allow people with disabilities to see themselves as employable. For an example of this, I'm gonna stop this screen and I'm gonna share an example of a website that one of our AOCs created for this purpose. And so, the bottom line is just something as simple as this, a website that kind of links everything together so that way it's all in one place. If you were a person with a disability and you're looking to make the bridge between work to benefits, then you could come to a website like this and, you would say, I would like to look for employment. I would like to begin training, or that I have found employment and I'm starting soon. Like either of those options, when you go into something like this, the fact that it looks like this and allows you to collect data and information would make kind of everything streamlined. Marco, since Marcos is the one that created this website, I'm also gonna allow Marcos to add some additional information.
Hi, everyone. All right, so DRC, if you can go back to the initial page and then if we'll all kind of walk through it together. Um, uh, excuse me, I got two devices going. It's gonna cooperate in just a second. There we go. Okay. All right, everyone. Let me begin by saying thank you to the Ford Foundation and EC&V for making this group possible. Let me say thank you to the group for the last year because I have learned so much from all of you guys and all of your experiences. Um, the theory of this website came from just our, you know, our weekly conversations and frustrations that came along. Um, so what we had thought up was, in theory, um, every resource that we have would be communicating with each other. And then we would have a resource as people with disabilities to go and let the government know that we either were looking for employment and what that would look like, that we already know what type of employment that looks like and would like to begin training, or we have already found employment. So in theory, you would come to this website in the beginning, and mine is going to give me a little bit of trouble just because I'm on a mobile device. There we go. Okay. So in theory, you would come to the website and you would, at the beginning of your employment journey, would say, I would like to look for employment. What does that look like? We click on the first button, and that would bring us to the second page. The second page, we would add our secure information, name, address, social security number, so that the system knows what resources we already receive, which in theory, these different governmental organizations, if they spoke to each other, would already be aware of at the state, federal, or at the federal, state, and local level. So you add all your information, then you would go on to your next page. Go ahead and hit that submit button for me. That page would bring you to the last page of this thread, which would be, welcome, John Doe. We see that you live in certain state, and these are the federal, state, and local resources that would be affected if you began making money. So in order to help you better, what would be the fields that you would be looking in, which are the job skills that you already have, what is the area that you're seeking employment, if it's not, I'm in the Southwest, if I'd like to, join my friends in this group and move up to the Northeast, I could put that here. Am I willing to relocate, and what type of work am I looking for, on-site, remote, or hybrid? Then I would hit submit, and that would take me to my final page. My final page would, congratulations on your first step to gainful employment. And then in this page, it would give me a theoretical roadmap of the things that I already received, and it would tell me exactly how much I'm able to earn, in theory, with the minimum wage of certain states. It would tell me how many hours I'm able to work at a minimum wage level, but we said gainful employment, so obviously we would want something above the minimum wage level. And it would give me access to resources in my area or in the area that I would like to live in um, in order to be able. So if I was moving to Virginia, it would tell me this is the transportation that you would need in this area. These are the services that we provide at the federal government level, and this is how employment would affect those also. And it would also assure you with different things in that report on how you would be able to get off of those services, at what level, and how you would safely be able to get back onto those services if there was a need. If your needs as a person with a disability change, or if you don't have gainful employment anymore. So that would be the first button. If we could back up and go back to the initial page again. So the second button would say, I would like to begin training for employment. We click on that button, it brings us again to the secure page that would have, that would ask us for our specifics. That page, like I mentioned before, would be connected to systems that should theoretically already be in place: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, transportation subsidies, anything that that would be affected by us having gainful employment. So we would add all our information. We'd go to the next page, and the next page would ask me what type of training I would want, if it's secondary education or if it's some type of vocation mentor program. That would generate jobs in the next pull down. That would ask us what area we would want to train in. And if we have previous experience in that field, then we would click submit. And that would bring us to our final page in that thread, which would be, congratulations, you've taken your first steps towards gainful employment. And on this page, it would give us the resources in that field. If it, wherever it is that I would want to move in, if I want to stay in my area, if there's community colleges, universities that would offer secondary education in that area, or if I want to do vocational training. And it would also take in consideration the jobs that I already have, or jobs that I already have experience in. And it would give me that safe roadmap on how to get on, or how to properly let the government know that we're going to begin earning money at some point. It would give you information about programs such as Ticket to Work. It would give you a detailed view of how to get off of those services and get back on. If we could go back to the initial page. And then we have our final and most important button is I have found employment and am starting soon. So then we click on that, and it again brings us to the secure page. And this time, this secure page is going to be very important because this is going to let the government know that you are going to start earning money, and that earning money is possibly going to trigger those negative effects that a lot of people with disabilities and many people in this group with disabilities deal with, is the fear of losing our resources if we become gainfully employed. So that we would add all our information here, and that would bring us to our next page. Our next page is our congratulatory page. And there would be more information that would be on here, but the big one is the EIN number for the employer. It would be twofold. It would give us the opportunity to let the government know that we are going to be working for this company, but it also lets them know that, you know what, this person has been hiring people with disabilities, and it's possibly something that we could speak to the SILs and SILPs about, or any organizations at the federal, state, or local level. It would ask us the salary, the hours, and then it would give us the resources that we could have in that area that are crucial to employment. If it's walkability, if it's rollability, if it's public transportation, if it's all of these things that we are going to, best case scenario, get off of, it would give us a whole list of those resources. And then it would do the most crucial thing, which would give us a breakdown on which ones would be affected at which level, how long we could ride that out for, which ones we could pay into, and how to quickly and safely be able to get back onto those programs if needs change in our health or in our employment status. So I would challenge people to look at this, not from the engineering side, but from the ideas and dreamer side, because we understand that there is a lot of things that we're possibly brushing over. But the way I explained it to the gentleman who helped me with this is, don't think about it from the car builder side, think about it from the side of the people in the community that are going to be using the roads that were already built and but weren't built for the vehicles that they had access to, coming to the car builders and being like, look, you already built the roads, you already built all these things, they don't work for my community. But we've spoken to our community, and this here would help us navigate your roads.
And yeah, I mean, to Marcos's point, I mean, the whole point of the website is essentially to streamline the process. I mean, as a disabled person, one of the biggest problems that we have is kind of thinking about how all of these things work concurrently. You know, how many hours can I work? How much money can I earn? What will that do to my benefits? And what we're talking about is this website taking all of that work out, like basically doing all of the work for you. And so it would be, you know, even though this is a prototype and, you know, it was just something that we were just kind of talking about, this is sorely needed. Like, this is a website that would be, you know, if it were implemented, it probably trafficked millions of times every day, because it's something that's so common and so complicated that, you know, the general public has no idea. So Marcos, thank you very much for that explainer. I think, you know, anybody that wants to jump on this project should definitely get in contact with you, because that would be super, super helpful. So thank you again. I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint now, if everybody is good. Okay, so yeah, thank you. And, you know, like I said, it really kind of speaks to, you know, what I'm talking about in relation to, you know, our summary, which is basically that on top of everything else that we've been talking about, in relation to all of our above suggestions, you know, we said that transportation and infrastructure design are important to the non-disabled public, but they are absolutely crucial to the disability community's ease of movement and the ability to maintain employment. You know, the ability to have subsidies for broadband to facilitate remote and flex work, as well as investments in caregiver and insurance plans tailored to the fully employed disability community, are also nationwide issues that have to be addressed in order to encourage both employment options for and employment growth for people with disabilities. You know, the bottom line is fear is real. And, you know, up until this point, our conversation, so much goes into, you know, how do we find employers that are willing to help people? You know, how do we convince employers to bring people with disabilities to the table? But a lot of times the conversation doesn't go into, well, why aren't people with disabilities actually sitting at the table to begin with? Like, how do we get them to be ready to work? Because the bottom line is, in our conversation, we said, if the Amazons of the world literally said, we have 1 million jobs for just disabled people, here you go, would people even show up? Like, would they come to the table ready to do the work? And, you know, the bottom line is, you can't really be ready to do the work if you can only earn, you know, 10 cents or whatever. You know, if you only have a certain amount of money that you can have, it severely limits your ability to have a great quality of life. And so our suggestions kind of run the gamut of all the different things that can be considered, but I do think that they are, you know, the most important. Which leads us to the third and final issue of social empowerment, which I would argue I mean, yes, employment and housing are really important, but we don't just live to work, and we don't just work to live. And so with this one, it was just this overarching idea that disability should be widely represented in the world and not just in medicine. Our heroes, lovers, fantasies, villains, and everything in between should be both seen and experienced. The bottom line is, as people with disability already know, the general public only thinks of disability typically as a negative, and it gets categorized under the World Health Organization's idea of an impairment. But when you do it in that way, people's lives often get shrunk down into, doctor's appointments, medical bills, and, just endless trauma. And that really is not what disability is about. It should be much more expanded and much more cohesive. So to that idea, we were saying from, non-speaking and nonverbal communications in order to physical barriers, it all matters. In the disability community, we say, if you've met one disabled person, you've met one disabled person. But in general, society has created a monolith which disregards other types. And so that makes it harder for everybody. But we have, like, when you have examples like this part of this article, which came from our AOCs, Josh and Emma, things like this can help change the conversation. And so, some of the things that they were addressing were questions like, what are common assumptions about non-speaking people? And, they said that we are stupid, absent, and someone to be pitied. Because we don't talk, people assume that we don't have anything to say. It is frequently paired with assessment because of functionality. And then the question of, like, how does exclusion further isolate non-speakers? And it says, the world cannot conceive of our potential. We are routinely ignored, excluded, and cut off from opportunities. Frequently, we are left alone and not perceived as social beings, which is very isolating. And most of us crave companionship and intimacy, which are both vexing challenges for the non-speaker. And this is just two of what was probably 15 different things from this article. And I would encourage anyone who is watching this presentation to actually seek out the article on ECMV's webpage to read more fully, because it's a great article that really addresses a lot of issues. But the bottom line is, social empowerment isn't just ramps. It isn't just Braille. It isn't just ASL. And the thing is that people kind of tie it to these big ticket issues that people just think about when they think of disability as like a flashing neon sign. And it's more about, as Josh and Emma said, intimacy and companionship, because that's literally the core of a life. And so, if we can start thinking about it in terms of that, like intimacy and companionship, then I think, a lot of these other issues become, just common knowledge. And so to that end, we had some suggested social interventions, but we were saying, like, one of the biggest ones is the amendment to the Marriage Equality Clause. Right now, Congress is debating the Defense of Marriage Equality Act, which essentially helps to enshrine marriage equality afforded to gay and lesbian couples in the United States. But that does not include people with disabilities. And we were saying that the right to marry should extend beyond current provisions of sexuality or gender orientation, and should also include disability in its federal definition, by guaranteeing couples on Social Security the right to benefits without fear of loss due to taxable income. That is a massive issue that, for those of you on this presentation, I just recently got off of a month-long cruise. And when I was talking to various people on the cruise ship, I brought this up a lot. And everybody's mouth just fell open, because they literally were like, what? That makes no sense. And but then I explained it, and I was like, if you have two people who both collect benefits and they get married, the US federal government will be like, that's a taxable income. You no longer need benefits, and we will take them. And then I was like, people have to get divorced in order to maintain their standard of living, which is absolutely ridiculous. And so this is a fairly common issue in the disability community that is completely ignored by the general public. And so some interventions from the congressional side, I think would help to alleviate this, mainly because it's a no-brainer. Two people should be allowed to live without fear of losing benefits. Secondly, and arguably most important, we argue that disability visibility in the media should be bigger. We have entered into the era of diversity and inclusion, but disability is often the very last thing that comes up in the list. And so, we were saying that we need to leverage the purchasing power and the influence of the disability community. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 5 adults worldwide has some type of disability. That's 20% of humanity. We're talking almost 2 billion people. And those are the people who are actually known to be disabled. My personal belief is that it's actually closer to 1/3, which would make it almost 33% of the world. And so because of that, media should heed the call of disability community and take advantage of this vast consumer block by making meaningful, conscious efforts to put disability at the forefront of diversity and inclusion initiatives. And every day I read more and more and more about how organizations are, like Respectability, are working with NBC Universal and Netflix and all these kind of things to kind of start to do this work. They are starting to put more and more people with disabilities in their programs and in their acting and in the shows, but there's almost no conversation about writers, directors, producers, and like the peoples that have helped to create all of this kind of stuff. What good is it to have a disabled person on screen if the person who's dressing them doesn't understand how a body works? If you're creating costumes and clothing for a period drama, you need to understand how disability operates. And so without that information, what ends up happening will be short-sighted and incorrect. And so, we just argue that people with lived experience should be the people that are actually put into the space to be able to do the work. But they also need the opportunity to be able to do so. And so, in summary, we said that the idea of disability in a social context is in many ways the most complicated because it recognizes seeing disabled people just as they are and not how society portrays them. However, the fundamental principles that we believe are the strongest in this regard are the right to marry and love and the media's abilities to show authentic disability experiences as a spectrum as opposed to a singular experience. And so, I just love that people with disabilities do have the ability to experience the whole spectrum of life, but the way the world typically sees it, none of that is shown. So while we are on the path to do this work, we just need to expand how we're thinking about it to ensure that it's not just, white autistic people who are on all the Netflix shows or, just, Hispanic deaf people who are in, specific shows or specific networks. We want to make sure that it's expanded in as many ways as possible. And so, yeah, in relation to this, we have several pages of resources that are included, and it kind of runs the gap for everything that we've been talking about in this presentation. And, like I said, just to give you guys an overview, these are just several of the pages that we have here, which talk about everything from employment resources to the future of workforce inclusion to government opportunities for people with disabilities and employers looking for accommodations. We have some sample lease clauses that people can look at if they're trying to figure out ways to make their development properties more inclusive. We have Place in the World reports, talks about how to standardize housing and community options for people with autism, as well as all kinds of things from podcasts that talk about disability housing and where to find it, as well as, of course, like I said, Our Stomping Ground, which I mentioned earlier, with their amazing program and network that they have that kind of shows how you can do inclusive housing kind of all in one place, as well as our podcast episodes that we put together as a group. And you can see where we talk about employment as well as aviation